The sound of 60-year-old crystal shattering against the marble floor silenced the room faster than a gunshot. 20 of the city's most elite investors froze their champagne flutes, hovering halfway to their lips. In the center of the room, Richard Sterling stood over his trembling wife, his face twisted in a snarl that betrayed the polished veneer of the perfect CEO. He pointed a shaking finger at the door, his voice dripping with venom. "Get out! You are nothing but an embarrassment to this family. Leave now, and don't you dare look back." Sarah tears streaming down her face, turned to flee, unaware that in exactly 3 minutes the doors would open again, and a man with enough power to buy Richard's entire life was about to change everything with 4 simple words. "She is my wife." The chandelier above the dining table at the Sterling estate was made of imported Austrian glass, casting a fractured, shimmering light over the guests below. It was beautiful cold and excessively expensive, much like everything else Richard Sterling owned, including, he often thought, the reputation he had built from scratch. Richard sat at the head of the mahogany table, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke Armani suit. He was a handsome man, in a sharp, predatory way, with slicked-back dark hair and eyes that constantly scanned the room for weakness. Tonight was the most important night of his career. He was hosting the board members of Obsidian Global, a venture capital firm considering a $50 million injection into his tech startup Nexus. To his right sat Mr. Thomas Galloway, the gruff, no-nonsense chairman of Obsidian. To his left sat Jessica Vane. Jessica was officially Richard's chief marketing officer, but anyone with eyes could see she was much more. She wore a dress of crimson silk that clung to her figure like a second skin, her laugh a little too loud, her hand lingering a little too long on Richard's forearm. And then at the far end of the table, sitting in the shadows near the kitchen door, was Sarah. Sarah Sterling looked nothing like the woman Richard had married 4 years ago. The spark in her hazel eyes had been extinguished, replaced by a perpetual flinch, as if she were constantly anticipating a blow, either verbal or physical. She wore a simple faded navy dress that she had owned for years. Richard had forbidden her from buying anything new for this event, claiming that money was tight, despite the brand-new Porsche parked in the driveway. "The market is shifting," Richard said, his voice smooth and commanding. He swirled his wine, a 1998 Cabernet that cost more than Sarah's father had made in a year. "Nexus isn't just adapting to the future. We are dictating it. That's why your investment is safe with us, Thomas." Mr. Galloway chewed his steak slowly, his eyes narrowing. "The numbers look good, Richard, but we invest in people as much as products. A man's home life tells you a lot about his discipline." Richard smiled tight. "I couldn't agree more." "Sarah," Galloway boomed, startling her, "you've been quiet. What do you think of your husband's expansion plans?" The table went silent. Sarah's hand trembled, her fork clattering softly against the china. She looked up, her eyes wide and terrified. She knew nothing of the expansion plans. Richard never spoke to her about work. He barely spoke to her at all unless it was to criticize her cooking or her appearance. Sarah stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I believe Richard is very dedicated." Jessica let out a soft, cruel giggle, hiding it behind her napkin. "Oh, bless her heart. Sarah isn't really the business type, are you, sweetie? She's more of a homebody." "Jessica helps me with the strategy," Richard interjected quickly, shooting Sarah a look of pure ice. "Sarah manages the house. Though looking at the dust on the mantelpiece, we might need to reassess that department too." A few of the junior executives chuckled nervously. Sarah looked down at her lap, her face burning with shame. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell them that there was no maid, that she cleaned this 6-bedroom mansion by herself every day, that she cooked the meals, ironed Richard's shirts, and nursed him through his hangovers, only to be treated like a parasitic growth. But she said nothing. She never did. The service staff began to clear the plates for the main course. Sarah stood up to help instinct taking over. "Sit down," Richard snapped. The volume of his voice made Mrs. Galloway jump. Richard cleared his throat, forcing a smile. "Sorry, I just mean, we have staff for that, Sarah. Stop acting like a servant. It's embarrassing." Sarah sank back into her chair, fighting back tears. "So," Jessica said, leaning forward, drawing the eyes of the men at the table. "Thomas, Richard and I were thinking of hosting the annual gala in Monaco this year. It would be a perfect statement for the brand." "Monaco." Galloway raised an eyebrow. "Ambitious." "We believe in ambition," Richard said, placing his hand over Jessica's on the table, right in front of everyone. It was a subtle gesture, but to Sarah it felt like a knife in the chest. They weren't even hiding it anymore. The waiter, a young man named Daniel, who had always been kind to Sarah, moved to pour wine into Jessica's glass. As he did, Jessica gestured wildly with her hand while telling a story. Her arm hit the bottle. Red wine cascaded across the white tablecloth, splashing onto Jessica's crimson dress and Richard's sleeve. "You idiot!" Richard roared, jumping up. But he wasn't looking at the waiter. He was looking at Sarah. "I didn't do it," Sarah whispered, shrinking back. "You bumped the table." Richard lied, his face reddening with a rage that had been simmering all evening. He needed a scapegoat. He needed to show these men he was in control, and blaming the staff was petty. Blaming his clumsy wife was a power move he had used 1,000 times. "I saw you. You're so clumsy, Sarah. Always ruining everything." "Richard, please," Sarah begged, aware of the 20 pairs of eyes watching the spectacle. "It wasn't me." "Don't you dare lie to me." Richard grabbed his napkin and threw it onto his plate. The room was deadly silent. "I have tried, Sarah. I have tried to make you presentable. I have tried to drag you up to my level, but you are an anchor around my neck." "Richard, that's enough," Mr. Galloway said quietly, his expression unreadable. "No, it isn't. Thomas," Richard said breathless, his ego spiraling out of control. He felt the deal slipping. He felt the judgment. He needed to cut the dead weight. He needed to show Jessica and Galloway that he was ready for a new life. "She does this on purpose. She hates my success." He walked around the table, his heavy footsteps thudding on the floor. He grabbed Sarah by the arm, his grip bruising. "Richard, you're hurting me. I'm done hurting myself by keeping you around," he hissed. He hauled her up from the chair. "Get out!" "What?" Sarah gasped. Outside, the wind was howling. A severe thunderstorm had been battering the city for hours. "You heard me. Get out of my house. I want you gone. Tonight. Now." "But it's pouring," Sarah cried, panic rising in her chest. "I have nowhere to go. My family. I don't have anyone." "You should have thought of that before you decided to be a useless waste of space," Richard spat. He dragged her toward the heavy oak front doors. Jessica watched from the table, a smug, satisfied smirk playing on her red lips. She took a sip of her wine, unbothered. Richard threw the door open. The rain was coming down in sheets, a grey curtain of water. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the windows. "Richard, please," Sarah screamed, clinging to the doorframe. "I have no money. I have no phone. Not my problem anymore," Richard said. With a violent shove, he pushed her out onto the wet stone steps. Sarah stumbled, the heel of her old shoe breaking, and she fell hard onto the abrasive concrete of the driveway, scraping her knees. The cold rain soaked her, instantly plastering her hair to her face. "And don't come back," Richard yelled over the roar of the wind. "I'll have the divorce papers sent to whatever gutter you end up in." He slammed the heavy door shut. The sound echoed like a final judgment. The lock clicked. Sarah lay on the driveway, the freezing rain mixing with the hot tears on her face. She was alone. She was broken. And inside the warm, golden-lit house, the man she had loved was laughing. The cold was agonizing. It wasn't just a chill. It was a biting, aggressive freeze that seeped into Sarah's bones within minutes. She dragged herself up from the driveway, her knees bleeding, her navy dress heavy with water. She looked back at the house. Through the large bay window of the dining room, she could see them. Richard was laughing now, pouring more wine. Jessica was leaning into him, whispering something in his ear. They had already forgotten her. She had been erased. Sarah began to walk down the long, winding driveway toward the main road. The Sterling estate was located in the hills of Kingswood, an exclusive gated community miles from the city centre. There were no buses here, no taxis roaming the streets, just high walls, security cameras, and iron gates designed to keep people like her out. She hugged her arms around her chest, shivering violently. "Where do I go?" she thought. "Who do I have?" Her parents had passed away 5 years ago in a car accident, the same year she met Richard. He had been her savior then, the charming executive who swept the grieving, lonely girl off her feet. He had promised to take care of her. It was all a lie. He had isolated her, cut off her friends, and drained the small inheritance her parents had left her to invest in his company. She was destitute. She reached the massive iron gates at the end of the driveway. The security guard, a man named Miller, who usually waved at her, wasn't in the booth. The gate was closed. She squeezed through the pedestrian gap, stumbling out onto the dark, slick asphalt of the main road. Headlights from a passing car blinded her, for a moment the vehicle swerving and honking aggressively, before speeding off, spraying her with dirty puddle water. Sarah collapsed onto the grass verge, defeated. She curled into a ball, sobbing into the mud. "God, please," she whispered into the darkness. "Just let it end. Please help me." She closed her eyes, ready to let the hypothermia take her. Then a light appeared. It wasn't the harsh yellow glare of a normal car. It was a crisp, brilliant white beams that cut through the rain like lasers. A low, powerful hum vibrated through the ground. Sarah looked up, squinting. A convoy was approaching. 2 black SUVs flanking a massive, vintage Rolls-Royce Phantom, a car that exuded quiet, old-world power. The vehicles weren't speeding. They were moving with a deliberate, regal pace. They slowed as they saw the figure huddled on the side of the road. Sarah tried to scramble back, terrified. Was it the police, or worse, men who preyed on vulnerable women at night? The convoy came to a smooth halt right in front of her. The rear door of the Rolls-Royce opened before the car had even fully stopped. A driver in a full chauffeur's uniform stepped out with an umbrella, moving with military precision. But he wasn't the one who caught Sarah's attention. An older man stepped out from the back seat. He was tall, imposing, with silver hair combed back perfectly. He wore a heavy wool trench coat over a tuxedo. He leaned on a cane topped with a silver hawk's head. His face was lined with age, perhaps in his late 70s, but his eyes were sharp, piercing blue and alight with a terrifying intensity. He didn't look like a man who got out in the rain. He looked like a man who commanded the rain to stop. He walked straight towards Sarah, ignoring the chauffeur trying to hold the umbrella over him. He let the rain hit his expensive coat, his eyes locked on her face. "Sarah," the old man's voice rasped. It was a voice of gravel and authority, but it trembled slightly. Sarah looked up, shivering so hard her teeth chattered. Do I know you?" The old man's face crumbled for a split second, an expression of profound grief, before hardening into a mask of cold fury. He looked at her bleeding knees, her soaked dress, the bruise forming on her arm where Richard had grabbed her. "My God," he whispered. He turned to the chauffeur. "Get her in the car. Now turn up the heat. Get the blankets." "Sir, wait," Sarah stammered, backing away. I can't pay you. I don't know who you are." The old man knelt. He didn't care about the mud ruining his trousers. He took his warm, gloved hands and cupped her freezing face. "You don't remember me," he said softly, a tear mixing with the rain on his cheek. "He said you were dead. He told me you died in the accident with your parents." "Who?" Sarah asked, her mind spinning. "Richard Sterling." The man spat the name like a curse. Sarah froze. "You know Richard?" The old man stood up, his height seeming to double. He looked up the hill toward the Sterling Manor, where the lights were still blazing. "I know him," the man said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low growl. "I know him as the man who has been cashing the checks I sent to his wife for 5 years. "Wife," Sarah whispered. I'm his wife." The old man looked down at her, and for the first time Sarah saw a resemblance, not in their faces, but in the feeling of connection, a pull she couldn't explain. "No, my dear," the old man said firmly. "You are not his wife. Richard Sterling is a fraud, and tonight he is going to learn that there are some people in this world you do not touch." He turned to the head of his security detail, a massive man with an earpiece. "James," the old man commanded. "Yes, Mr. Kensington. Open the gate," the old man said, pointing his cane at the Sterling driveway. "We are going to the party." "Sir." James hesitated. "This is private property. If we force entry—" The old man. Arthur Kensington, the billionaire patriarch of the Kensington dynasty, a man who owned half the steel mills in the country and buildings in every major city, smiled. It was a smile that promised violence. "I am Arthur Kensington," he said. "I am the law in this town. Break down the gate." He gently guided Sarah into the back of the Rolls-Royce, wrapping her in a cashmere blanket that smelled of cedar and safety. "Rest now, Sarah," he said, closing the door. "You've been lost a long time, but I've found you, and I am going to remind Mr. Sterling exactly who he stole from." The engines roared. The lead SUV rammed the iron gates of the community, snapping the lock like a twig. The convoy surged up the hill toward the house where Richard was raising a toast to his own success, unaware that the grim reaper of his career and his life was coming up the driveway in a Rolls-Royce. Inside the Sterling estate, the atmosphere had shifted from awkward tension to raucous celebration. With Sarah gone, the problem was removed. Richard Sterling felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He poured another glass of the 1998 Cabernet for Thomas Galloway, his hand steady, his smile charming. "You have to understand, Thomas," Richard said, leaning back in his chair, the picture of a relaxed alpha male. "Sarah, she has mental health issues, severe ones. I've tried to shield her from the public eye, but tonight was a breaking point. I couldn't let her disrespect you or the sanctity of this deal." Jessica Vane nodded enthusiastically, placing a manicured hand on Galloway's shoulder. Richard is a saint for putting up with it for so long. Most men would have institutionalized her years ago. She's unstable. Mr. Galloway swirled his wine, looking thoughtful. It was certainly a dramatic exit, he grunted. But if what you say is true, Richard, then you made a hard executive decision. We need a CEO who can cut loose dead weight. Exactly, Richard beamed. To Nexus, and to the 50 million. He raised his glass. The 20 guests raised theirs. The crystal chimed. Boom! The sound wasn't thunder. It was the front door of the mansion, solid oak, reinforced and triple-locked, being blown off its hinges. The noise was deafening, shaking the floorboards beneath their feet. The heavy doors slammed onto the marble floor of the foyer with a crash that echoed like an explosion. Shards of wood skittered across the polished tile. What the hell? Richard dropped his wine glass. It shattered, staining the Persian rug blood red. Every guest jumped to their feet. Jessica screamed. "Call the police!" Richard yelled, his face turning pale. "We're being robbed. Someone get the security." But before anyone could reach for a phone, the heavy tread of boots filled the hallway. 4 men in tactical black suits, wearing earpieces and bearing the insignia of Kensington Private Security, marched into the dining room. They didn't hold weapons, but their sheer size and coordinated movement were more terrifying than guns. They fanned out, securing the room in seconds, blocking the exits. "Who are you?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking. "This is private property. I'll have you arrested." The security guards didn't answer. They simply stood like statues, staring straight ahead. Then the lead guard, James, stepped aside. "Clear," James said into his wrist mic. Through the broken doorway, the sound of a cane tapping against the marble floor grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. It was a slow, rhythmic sound that silenced the room completely. Arthur Kensington walked into the light of the chandelier. He was still wet from the rain, his silver hair plastered slightly to his forehead, his trench coat dripping. But he didn't look like a victim of the storm. He looked like the storm itself given human form. His blue eyes swept across the room, judging every soul at the table. Behind him, huddled in the oversized cashmere blanket, walked Sarah. She was flanked by 2 more guards who supported her as she limped. She looked small, pale, and terrified, but her eyes were fixed on Richard. "Sarah!" Jessica gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "You brought thugs." Richard's shock turned to fury. He puffed out his chest, trying to regain control of his territory. He stormed toward the old man, stopping just inches away from him. "Who do you think you are?" Richard spat, pointing a finger in Arthur's face. "Breaking into my house, dragging my mentally ill wife back here with these hired goons. I don't know who you are, old man, but you have made a grave mistake. I am Richard Sterling." Arthur Kensington looked at Richard's finger, then at Richard's face. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. "And I," Arthur said, his voice filling the room with a terrifying calm, "am the man who owns the bank that holds the mortgage on this house. I am the man who owns the firm that insures your car. And I am the man who is about to ruin your entire existence." Mr. Galloway, the chairman of Obsidian, stood up slowly. His face had gone completely white. He dropped his napkin. Mr. Kensington," Galloway stammered. Richard whipped around. "You know this geriatric trespasser, Thomas?" "Shut up, Richard." Galloway snapped panic in his voice. He rushed around the table, bowing his head slightly toward Arthur. "Mr. Kensington, sir, I had no idea. I mean, we are honored. I didn't know you were in the city." "Kensington," Jessica whispered, the colour draining from her face. "As in the Kensington Group." Richard froze. The name hit him like a physical blow. Arthur Kensington wasn't just wealthy. He was a titan. He was worth billions. He was the kind of money that didn't just buy companies. It bought countries. "Mr. Galloway," Arthur acknowledged him with a cold nod. "I see you are dining with a thief." "Thief?" Richard laughed nervously, trying to salvage the situation. "Now hold on. There's been a misunderstanding, sir. I assume you found Sarah on the road. As I told my guests, she is unwell. She wanders off. I was just about to go look for her." "Liar," Sarah said. Her voice was weak, but in the silence of the room, it was clear. "You threw me out. You said you never wanted to see me again." "She's hallucinating," Richard said, quickly, sweating now. "Honey, come here. Let's get you to bed." He reached for her. Arthur's cane moved in a blur. He slammed the heavy silver hawk's head down onto the table, shattering a porcelain serving platter. The violence of the strike made everyone jump. "Do not touch her," Arthur snarled. "She is my wife," Richard shouted, his desperation mounting. "I have the marriage certificate, I have the rights. You can be the King of England for all I care, but the law is the law. She is Mrs. Sarah Sterling, and she stays here." Arthur stepped forward, towering over Richard. The room held its breath. "You are right about one thing, Mr. Sterling," Arthur said softly. "The law is the law, and that is why you are going to prison." Arthur turned to face the stunned guests. He reached into the inside pocket of his wet coat and pulled out a leather-bound wallet. He opened it, revealing a photograph. It was an old photo, worn at the edges. It showed Arthur 20 years younger, standing next to a beautiful woman who looked exactly like Sarah. He held it up for the room to see. "You say she is your wife," Arthur said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "But you are wrong." He turned back to Richard, his eyes burning with a fire that could scorch the earth. "She is not your wife, Richard. She is my wife." The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Richard stared at the old man, his mouth slightly open. He looked at Sarah, then back at Arthur. A nervous, incredulous laugh bubbled up from his throat. "Your wife," Richard scoffed, looking around at the guests for support. "Is this a joke? Look at her. She's 28. You're ancient. This is disgusting. You're some senile old billionaire who picked up a stray and thinks." "Silence!" Mr. Galloway roared at Richard. "Let him speak." Arthur handed his wet coat to James, revealing the impeccable tuxedo beneath. He adjusted his cufflinks, regaining his composure. He walked over to Sarah and gently took her hand. She didn't pull away. She looked at him with a mixture of confusion and a strange, dawning recognition. 5 years ago. Arthur began addressing the room like a courtroom. "I was in a car accident in the Swiss Alps. I was driving. My wife was in the passenger seat. We swerved to avoid a truck on an icy pass. The car went over the edge." Sarah gasped. A flash of memory hit her screeching tires, the feeling of falling the cold bite of snow. "I was found 3 days later, half frozen in a ravine." Arthur continued, his voice tight with pain. "But my wife, she was gone. The river had taken the passenger side of the vehicle. The authorities searched for weeks. They found nothing. No body, no trace. Eventually, she was declared dead." He squeezed Sarah's hand. "I grieved for 5 years. I built a mausoleum. I stopped living. I thought my life was over." He turned his glare on Richard. "But she didn't die. She was washed downstream. She survived, but she had head trauma. Massive amnesia. She didn't know who she was. She was a Jane Doe in a hospital in France for 6 months." Richard's face was turning a shade of grey, usually reserved for corpses. He began to back away toward the kitchen door, but a Kensington security guard stepped silently into his path. "And that," Arthur pointed a shaking finger at Richard, "is where you come in." I met her in a coffee shop," Richard stammered. "In London. She told me she had no family." "You met her in the hospital," Arthur corrected him, his voice icy. "My private investigators have been tearing the world apart for 5 years, looking for a trace. We finally found the records last week. You were a volunteer orderly at the St. Jude Hospital in Lyon. You saw a beautiful woman with no memory, no name, and most importantly, a platinum locket around her neck with the Kensington crest." Sarah's hand flew to her throat. She wasn't wearing it now. "I pawned it," Richard admitted softly before catching himself. "I mean, I never saw a locket. We found the pawn shop, Richard," Arthur said. "You saw the crest. You looked it up. You realized this Jane Doe was linked to one of the wealthiest families in Europe. But instead of contacting me, instead of helping a lost woman find her husband, you saw a lottery ticket." The guests were whispering now looks of disgust directed at Richard. Jessica Vane had moved several feet away from him, acting as if she had never met him. "You seduced a woman who didn't even know her own name?" Arthur continued, his voice rising. "You whisked her away to England. You forged a background for her. You created Sarah Sterling out of thin air. You married her quickly, quietly, hoping that eventually her memory would return, or you could find a way to claim her trust fund legally." "That's insane," Richard shouted. "It's a conspiracy theory. I loved her." "You loved her." Arthur laughed, a harsh, bark-like sound. "I stood outside that window, Richard. I watched you throw her into the rain like garbage because she spilled some wine. You didn't love her. You kept her as a pet, a prisoner, waiting for the payout." Arthur turned to Sarah. He looked into her eyes with infinite tenderness. "Sarah isn't your name, my darling," he whispered. "Your name is Victoria Kensington. You are 32 years old. We were married in Vienna 6 years ago. You are an accomplished pianist, you speak 4 languages, and you are the love of my life." Sarah Victoria stared at him. The name Victoria echoed in her mind. It felt right, like a key turning in a rusted lock. "The piano," she whispered. She looked at the grand piano in the corner of the room covered in dust, because Richard hated music. "I always wanted to play, but he said I had no talent." "He lied to keep you small," Arthur said. "He needed you broken, so you wouldn't remember how strong you really are." Richard was panting now, trapped. "You can't prove any of this. It's her word against mine. She's my wife, by law." Arthur smiled. It was the smile of a predator who had already closed the trap. "Actually, Richard, that's the best part. Since Victoria was never declared legally dead in the UK, and our marriage was never annulled, your marriage to her is bigamy. It's void, null. It never happened." Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document. "And this," he said, tossing it onto the table next to the spilled wine, "is the audit of your company Nexus." Mr. Galloway stepped forward to look at the document. "What is this? I had my team run a background check on you the moment I realized you had my wife," Arthur said to Richard. "It turns out being a fraud is a habit. You've been embezzling from your own investors for 3 years. You're not expanding, Richard. You're bankrupt. You needed Galloway's $50 million just to stay out of jail. Galloway snatched the paper, reading the figures rapidly. His face turned purple. You cooked the books. You lied to the board. Thomas, wait. I can explain, Richard begged, reaching out. Don't come near me, Galloway shouted. The deal is off. I'm calling the authorities. No need, Arthur said calmly. I already did. From the distance, the wail of sirens began to pierce the storm. Blue and red lights flashed against the rain-streaked windows, joining the lightning. Richard looked around the room. His empire was crumbling in real time. His investors were looking at him with hatred. His mistress was looking at the floor, and the wife he had abused was looking at him with a sudden clarity. Sarah Victoria stepped away from the guard. She walked up to Richard. She didn't look like a battered housewife anymore. She stood tall, channeling the strength of the woman she used to be. You told me I was nothing, she said, her voice steady. You told me I was lucky you picked me up from the gutter. Richard sneered, trying one last time to hurt her. You are nothing. You're a brain-damaged invalid. Without me, you'd be dead. Smack. The sound of her hand connecting with his cheek was louder than the thunder. It was a slap 5 years in the making. Richard stumbled back, holding his face in shock. My name is Victoria Kensington, she said, her eyes flashing fire. And I am done being your victim. Arthur stepped up beside her, offering his arm. Shall we go, my dear? He asked. I believe this house is about to become a crime scene, and I have a much nicer home waiting for you. It has a piano. Sarah looked at Richard one last time, seeing him for what he truly was, small, pathetic, and alone. She took Arthur's arm. Yes, she said. Let's go home. The grand oak doors of the Sterling estate, already battered by the Kensington security team, were thrown open once again. This time, it was not a savior entering, but the executioners of Richard Sterling's carefully constructed reality. 4 police officers, their rain-slicked uniforms reflecting the chandelier light, marched into the foyer. Behind them walked a detective in a trench coat, looking tired and unimpressed by the opulence around him. Richard Sterling, the detective announced, his voice flat. Richard was leaning against the dining table, hyperventilating. The guests had backed away to the walls, desperate to dissociate themselves from the man they had been toasting only minutes ago. Jessica Vane was frantically typing on her phone, likely deleting emails and text messages that could implicate her in Richard's embezzlement schemes. This is a mistake, Richard screamed, sweat beading on his forehead. He pointed a trembling hand at Arthur Kensington, who stood near the door shielding Victoria from the draft. That man? That old lunatic broke into my house. He assaulted me. Arrest him. The detective didn't even look at Arthur. He walked straight up to Richard, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. Richard Sterling, you are under arrest for corporate fraud, embezzlement, and... The detective paused, glancing at a note in his notebook. Kidnapping and identity theft. Kidnapping. Richard choked out a laugh, though his eyes were wild with terror. She's my wife. You can't kidnap your own wife. We have a statement from the French authorities regarding a missing persons case from 5 years ago, and a sworn affidavit from Mr. Arthur Kensington regarding the falsification of medical records, the detective said calmly. He spun Richard around. Hands behind your back. As the cold steel clicked around Richard's wrists, the reality finally hit him. The perfect CEO mask shattered completely. He wasn't a shark. He was a cornered rat. Jessica, Richard yelled, struggling against the officer's grip. Tell them I'm innocent. You signed the papers too. You knew about the offshore accounts." The room gasped. Jessica froze her phone, slipping from her fingers and landing on the rug with a soft thud. She looked up her face, a mask of horrified betrayal. I don't know what you're talking about." Jessica stammered, tears instantly welling up in her eyes, a performance worthy of an Oscar. "I was just an employee. He forced me. He threatened me." "You lying witch," Richard roared, lunging at her, but the officers held him back. "We planned it all in Cabo." "You came up with the idea to fake the quarterly reports. Get him out of here," the detective ordered. As they dragged Richard Sterling toward the door, the same door he had thrown his wife out of, less than an hour ago, he passed by Victoria. She was standing by the entrance, wrapped in the cashmere blanket, Arthur's hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Richard looked at her, his eyes pleading, pathetic. "Sarah, baby, please," he whimpered. "I gave you a home. I took care of you when you were nobody. Don't let them do this. Tell them I'm a good husband." Victoria looked at the man who had made her feel small for 4 years. She looked at the bruise forming on her arm, where he had grabbed her. She remembered the nights spent crying in the bathroom while he entertained guests like Jessica. She stepped forward, just an inch. "My name is not Sarah," she said, her voice quiet, but piercing through the storm of Richard's panic. "And you were never a husband. You were a jailer." "Get him out," Arthur commanded, his voice like iron. The police dragged Richard into the rainy night. The flashing blue lights illuminated his face, twisted in a scream of rage and defeat, before he was shoved into the back of a squad car. Inside the house, the silence was heavy. Mr. Galloway, the investor, who had been ready to give Richard $50 million, walked up to Arthur. He looked shaken. "Mr. Kensington," Galloway said, wiping his brow. I owe you an apology. And a thank you. If you hadn't arrived, I would have signed that deal." "You should learn to vet your partners better, Thomas," Arthur said coolly. "A man who treats his wife like a servant is rarely a man of honor in business." Arthur turned his back on the room full of stunned elites. He looked down at Victoria. "Are you ready to go home, Victoria?" She looked around the cold, modern mansion that had been her prison. She looked at the spilled wine, the broken glass, the people who had laughed at her. "Yes," she whispered. "Take me away from here." Arthur guided her out to the waiting Rolls-Royce. As she slid into the leather seat, the warmth of the car enveloping her, she watched the police cars driving Richard away. For the first time in 4 years, the knot of anxiety in her chest began to loosen. She was safe. The Kensington estate was not a house. It was a sanctuary. Located 3 hours away in the rolling countryside, it was a sprawling manor of warm stone surrounded by ancient oak trees and manicured gardens. Unlike Richard's cold glass and steel showpiece, this house breathed history and love. When the Rolls-Royce pulled up the gravel driveway the following morning, the staff were waiting outside. The housekeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Higgins, burst into tears the moment she saw Victoria step out of the car. "Oh, my lady," Mrs. Higgins cried, rushing forward, but stopping just short of hugging her, unsure of the boundaries. We thought you were gone, forever." Victoria looked at the woman's tear-streaked face. A flicker of a memory sparked the smell of lavender detergent, a warm laugh in a kitchen. "Mrs. Higgins," Victoria tested the name on her tongue. The housekeeper sobbed openly. "Yes, ma'am." "Oh, praise be, she remembers." "Only fragments," Arthur said, gently placing a hand on Victoria's back. "She needs rest, lots of it, and no pressure. The next few weeks were a blur of recovery. Arthur hired the best neurologists in the country to visit the estate. They explained that her amnesia had been caused by the trauma of the crash, but her inability to recover her memories had been exacerbated by psychological conditioning. Richard had gaslit her so effectively, constantly rewriting her reality, that her brain had stopped trying to find the truth. But in the safety of the Kensington Manor, the fog began to lift. It happened in small moments. She would touch a velvet curtain and remember buying the fabric in Paris. She would smell the morning coffee and remember a cafe in Vienna. But the true breakthrough came on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after her rescue. Victoria was wandering through the west wing of the house, a quiet area filled with sunlight. She pushed open a set of double doors and found herself in a music room. In the center of the room stood a Steinway grand piano, its lid open. Dust motes danced in the light, falling across the ivory keys. Victoria walked toward it, her heart pounding. Richard had always told her she had no talent. He had forbidden her from humming, claiming it was annoying. "You have a screeching voice, Sarah," he would say. She sat on the bench. It felt familiar. The height was perfect. She reached out a trembling hand and pressed a single key. Middle C. The note rang out, pure and clear. Her fingers hovered over the keys. She didn't try to think. She just let her hands take over. Suddenly, a melody poured out of her. It wasn't a simple tune. It was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Her fingers flew across the keys with a dexterity and grace that shocked her. The music swelled, filling the room complex and melancholic and beautiful. She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't clumsy. She wasn't useless. She was a virtuoso. When the final note faded, she heard a soft clapping from the doorway. She turned to see Arthur standing there, leaning on his cane, his eyes red-rimmed. "You played that for me on our first anniversary," he said softly, walking into the room. "I used to sit here for hours just listening to you. For 5 years this house has been silent. I couldn't bear to let anyone else play it." Victoria stood up and rushed into his arms. For the first time, she didn't feel like a victim being saved. She felt like a wife returning to her husband. "I remember," she wept into his shoulder. "Arthur, I remember. I remember the blue dress I wore. I remember the waiter dropping the tray. I remember us." Arthur held her tight, burying his face in her hair. "Welcome back, my love." But the healing wasn't just about memories. It was about justice. A month later, a legal summons arrived. Richard Sterling's lawyers were attempting a Hail Mary. They were claiming that Arthur had kidnapped Sarah and brainwashed her. They were demanding she appear in court to testify at a preliminary hearing. "You don't have to do this," Arthur told her over breakfast, his face dark with worry. "I can have the lawyers handle it. You never have to see him again." Victoria set down her teacup. Her hand was steady. She looked different now. The faded navy dress was gone, replaced by a tailored emerald blouse that matched her eyes. Her hair was glossy and styled, but the biggest change was in her posture. She no longer hunched. "No," Victoria said firmly. "He spent 4 years silencing me. He doesn't get to silence me now. I want him to see me. I want him to see exactly who he messed with." The courthouse was besieged by reporters. The story of the resurrected heiress and the fraudulent CEO had captivated the nation. Cameras flashed as the black Rolls-Royce pulled up to the curb. Arthur stepped out first, extending his hand. Victoria emerged. She wore a suit of sharp crimson red, a deliberate choice. It was the color of the dress Jessica Vane had worn the night Richard threw her out. But on Victoria, it didn't look cheap or flashy. It looked like armor. She walked up the steps with her head high, ignoring the questions shouted by the press. Inside the courtroom, Richard Sterling was sitting at the defendant's table. He looked terrible. He had lost weight, his skin was sallow, and his expensive suit hung loosely on his frame. When he saw Victoria enter, he straightened up, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. He expected the timid, flinching Sarah. When Victoria walked past him, she didn't even blink. She sat in the witness box, took the oath, and looked straight at the jury. The defense attorney, a slimy man named Mr. Klein, tried to rattle her. "Mrs. Sterling," Klein began. "My name is Mrs. Kensington." Victoria corrected him, her voice ringing off the walls. "I do not answer to the name Sterling." "Right," Klein smirked. "Well, isn't it true that you suffered a head injury, that you are prone to confusion? Isn't it possible that my client, a benevolent man, took you in when you were confused, and now this billionaire," he gestured at Arthur, "has simply offered you a better deal?" The courtroom murmured. Richard smirked, thinking he had won. Victoria leaned into the microphone. "Mr. Klein," she said coolly, "your client didn't take me in. He isolated me. He spent 4 years systematically destroying my self-esteem so that I wouldn't question why a marketing consultant was terrified of her husband answering the door. He pawned my family heirlooms. He used my existence to appear stable to investors while he stole their money." She turned her gaze to Richard. "He is a small, frightened man who builds himself up by tearing others down. And regarding my memory, I remember everything now, including the night he threw me into a thunderstorm without a coat, telling me to die in a gutter. I didn't die, Richard. I survived, and I am here to ensure you never hurt another woman again." The jury was spellbound. Richard's smirk had vanished, replaced by open fear. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Jessica Vane testified against Richard in exchange for a reduced sentence, revealing every illegal transaction, every forged document, and every moment of mockery they had shared at Victoria's expense. The verdict was unanimous. Richard Sterling was found guilty on all counts: fraud, embezzlement, spousal abuse, and bigamy. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. As the bailiffs led him away in shackles, he looked back at the gallery. He locked eyes with Victoria one last time. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to beg, but she had already turned away. She was looking at Arthur, who was smiling at her with pride. Richard was dragged out the side door into a life of grey walls and iron bars, erased from the world he so desperately wanted to own. 6 months later, the Kensington Annual Charity Gala was the event of the season. The ballroom of the city's finest hotel was packed with the elite honest investors, philanthropists and artists. At the center of the room stood Arthur Kensington, looking 10 years younger than he had that rainy night. He tapped a spoon against his champagne glass, silencing the crowd. "Thank you all for coming," Arthur boomed. "Tonight is special. We are here raising money for the Victoria Foundation, a new initiative dedicated to helping victims of domestic abuse find legal aid and safe housing." Applause rippled through the room. "But I am not the one running it," Arthur said, his eyes twinkling. "I would like to introduce the chairwoman of the foundation, my partner, my heart, and the strongest woman I know. Please welcome Victoria Kensington." The double doors opened. Victoria stepped out. She wore a gown of shimmering gold, radiant and powerful. She walked to the microphone, no longer the broken woman in the faded navy dress, but a queen who had reclaimed her throne. She looked at the crowd, then at Arthur. She smiled a true, brilliant smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady and commanding. "For a long time, I was told I had no voice. I was told I was nothing. But I learned that our value is not defined by how others treat us, but by how we survive." She raised her glass. "To resilience, and to love that never forgets." As the room cheered, Arthur walked over and kissed her hand. The nightmare of Sarah Sterling was gone forever. Victoria Kensington was home. And that is the incredible story of how Richard Sterling lost everything by underestimating the woman he tried to destroy. It's a powerful reminder that no matter how dark things get, the truth has a way of coming out, and that true love acts as a shield, not a sword. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, please hit the like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. What did you think of Richard's punishment? Did he get what he deserved? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.